and dealing booze were thought to be bad for society, leading to prohibition in the early 1900s. The consensus today is that the cons of prohibition outweigh the pros. For the cons, you have violations of the law on an unprecedented scale, rampant corruption and infiltration of government elements into the highest levels of government, unequal enforcement and public backlash against police, and skyrocketing violence. For the pros, drinking declined somewhat. Prohibition was taken off the books due to overwhelming rejection from the same public that had earlier overwhelmingly supported it. Prohibition passes with constitutional amendment. No behavior is inherently criminal. For something to be a crime, there has to be some agreement by its members of society to make that behavior a crime. Even in situations where crimes do have a moral basis, they can still be highly variable. Stand your ground laws are an example. What's criminal isn't necessarily a self-evident truth. Crime is a product of the times and of social context. Crime is socially constructed. Through your interactions with your social world, you come to learn what crime is based on your social context. Social world is all the influences that link you to your society. Interactions equal conversations, encounters, readings, teachings, and any kind of exposure. You come to have a certain understanding of what crime is just by being a part of the society that surrounds you. For example, the Holocaust, LGBT rights. Social constructions of crime are always changing depending on historical context. WCTU for prohibition wouldn't have nearly as much power now as they used to. One cause of change is when making something criminal fails to improve society, when it actually makes things worse, like with prohibition. Another cause of change is when society's morals evolve, like with Germans and LGBT rights. In today's war on drugs, we may be in a moment when both of these things are appearing to happen. The war on drugs. War on drugs was started by President Nixon in the 1970s and revived by President Reagan in the 1980s. Like with alcohol, the American public has always been conflicted about drugs. In the early 1900s, alcohol was illegal and cocaine and heroin were legal. Now, alcohol is legal and cocaine and heroin are illegal. Pop culture glorifies drugs even when we are taught they are bad. Upper-class people who use drugs will teach their children not to. In Milburn's case, his dad encouraged his drinking. How did support for the war on drugs gain support? During Prohibition, the efforts of the WCTU were an example of a moral crusade. A concentrated effort to portray something as a dangerous, widespread threat to public welfare. Moral crusaders often try to create a sense of panic about the threat. Panic leads to the perception of something as threatening, worthy of criminalization. Public votes for legislators who passed those laws. History of drugs in America. During the 1800s, with advances in medicine, cocaine and opiates started being consumed widely. People initially didn't have a problem with this. Nerve and tonic stimulant, cocaine, cough elixir, heroin. It then became clear that these substances were highly addictive. Still, addiction wasn't seen as inherently criminal. It was a problem of middle, upper-class consumers. Drug laws have historically been motivated, at least in part, by xenophobia, racism against lower-class immigrant groups. Prohibition, European immigrants. Opium Exclusion Act of 1909, raging stoned Chinese immigrants. Very first anti-drug law in America. Marijuana tax of 1937, mellow stoned Mexicans. Pushed by DuPont, which was starting to make synthetic clothes like nylon. The war on drugs. Nixon first started the war on drugs. Reason for declaring it public enemy number one, heroin addiction among Vietnam vets. There was marijuana in Vietnam. Heroin addiction was derived from a poppy plant known as skag. 1 in 5 vets admitting to an addiction. Heroin, an opium derived from a poppy plant, mostly smoked in cigarettes or snorted. Heroin's effects are euphoria, feeling warm and safe, relief from physical and emotional pain. The reason for heroin addiction really comes down to one primary thing, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. Monstrous experience happens, generates fear or helplessness. Heroin is self-medication for a mental health problem. For returning vets, the focus was on treatment rather than criminalization. Funding for methadone clinics. Methadone is an addictive substance and doctors can calibrate the dosage to wean you off of it. For others, liberal activists, including young hippies and people of color, the focus was on criminalization. Senior officials singling out people to criminalize them for drugs. Nixon is split between targeting some and having sympathy for others, all in the name of the war on drugs. Nixon used the issue of veteran heroin addiction to push for broad criminal measures against drugs. Treatment versus criminalization. Treatment, framework of medical field. Criminalization, framework of law. Nixon uses army sympathy to push for political power in the war on drugs. War on drugs was reborn with the zero-tolerance policies of the 1980s with Reagan. Distinction erased between recreational drug use and drug addiction or abuse. At the center of the anti-drug revival was crack cocaine, which, as Americans during the 1800s found out, is highly addictive. Crack is powder cocaine converted into smokable nuggets. Its effects are euphoria, hyper-alertness, heightened energy, grandiosity, feeling of self-confidence, manic episodes, really high and up, at center of everything, super figure. Crack is cheap to produce. A new class of consumers was gaining easy access to a highly addictive drug, the lower class. Crack powder. Stress leads to addiction. Crack problem during the 1980s was viewed as having achieved epidemic levels. By the 1990s, the crack problem had subsided due to market consolidation and aggressive law enforcement. But the government's approach to crack solidified the tactics used in the post-Nixon war on drugs up until today. Goal of modern war on drugs. Criminalization leads to drug-free society. Criminalization in the war on drugs involves tactics of militarization. Difference between law enforcement and the military. Military-style tactics in the war on drugs. 1. Interdiction. Military term for preventing supplies from reaching the combat zone. Involved the actual military. The first President Bush used Army, Special Forces, National Guard. Prevent enemy supplies from getting to battle site. In the war on drugs, military went and destroyed drugs where they were being produced. Second, other military missions. Pentagon became the lead agency in monitoring drug smuggling. The US military actually attacked another country to arrest its leader for violation of American drug laws. And third is militarization of policing. In many ways, law enforcement became more like the military. Transfer of technology and tactics. For example, SWAT teams. 13% of police departments had them in 1980. By 1995, 89% did. Law enforcement became more like the military. If we've come to see military-style practices be natural aspects of law enforcement against criminal elements, this is because we've learned through our interactions with our social world that they are normal. Crime is socially constructed. The war on drugs, it has profoundly shaped the way street-level policing is practiced. Undercover operations, use of informants, civil asset forfeiture, drug raids, buy bust sting and sell bust reverse sting operations, narcs, busts are for evidence. Sting operations plus forfeiture equals justice or conflict of interest. Government can use assets gained for other operations. Selling. How effective is criminalization as a solution for the drug problem? Does criminalization raise demand? Of course not. Consumer demand is fueled by addiction. Addiction is a medical condition. Does criminalization erase supply? Of course not. Most supply's manpower comes from low-level dealers. Drug dealing does not make them rich. They get more than minimum wage. They have dignity. They aren't a cog. Drugs can be abused. Drugs can be destructive. Same also applies to gambling. Gambling isn't met with a hardcore criminalization in the same way drugs are, for either consumers or suppliers. Scientists used to think gambling as a compulsive behavior like nail biting. Recent developments in neuroscience have shown that gambling and drug addiction alter brain chemistry in similar ways. Addiction and the brain. Pleasurable activities. Release of a brain chemical called dopamine, which is what gives us that good feeling like sex and good food. Addictive drugs overflood the brain with dopamine. Brain gets used to artificially elevated levels of the chemical, causing increasing demand for more drugs. How tolerance builds. In severe addictions, dopamine deprivation results in withdrawal. Feeling physically sick, sleepless, fidgety, gamblers can experience withdrawal. The frontal lobe controls impulses. Prefrontal cortex is part of the frontal lobe most important for impulse control. Brain circuitry relating to dopamine and the feeling of reward lies in the limbic system. In addicts, neural pathways between the limbic system and the frontal lobe are significantly weakened. Addictive impulses become harder to control. These changes in the brain apply in similar fashion to both drug addiction and pathological gambling, according to brain imaging studies. Treating gambling like an addiction. Experts used to think of addiction as a dependency on a chemical. Now define it as repeatedly pursuing a rewarding experience despite serious repercussion. Pathological gambling responds better to the same kinds of therapy and medication used to treat drug addiction. CBT, medicines that reduce cravings. How should society respond to gambling addictions? Reasons people get addicted to drugs apply to gambling too. Mental health problems lead to self-medication. Developmental disorders. Constant exposure plus stress. The solution? Consideration of all strategies is required, not just criminalization. Law can be a possible tool for change, but it's just one of many. Thank you.